There are more than 400 codes of conduct, of ethics, around the world. Some of them are very short, some of them are very long, but all of them come down to these 5 core values. First of all, accuracy and fact-based communications, the ethic of truth, the idea that journalists do not tell malicious lies. They have an ethical obligation to strive to tell facts and to give the truth as they know it at any time. Secondly is the ethic of independence. Journalists are not propagandists. They are not people who speak for one particular interest. If they do so, they are merely propagandists. They are merely public relations people. Journalists have to be ethically, morally independent. Thirdly is the concept of impartiality. Journalists know that there is more than one side to a story. Very often, there are more than 2 sides to a story. The key ethic of journalism here is the ethic of inclusivity, making sure we listen to all voices and making sure those voices are represented in the stories that we tell. It's not objectivity, but it is a very important ethic of how journalism works. The 4th ethic of journalism, and probably, I think, the most important, is the ethic of humanity. It's the ethic that journalists always have to recognize is that they have to be aware of the words that they use and the images that they show and the impact that they have on others. They have to be aware that we are not there to incite hatred, incite racism, make hate speach, be warmongers. Our role is to show humanity to the society we serve. And the 5th ethic is the one that's most difficult, actually, for journalists. It's the ethic of being able to say sorry, of apologizing for your mistakes, of recognizing that when you make mistakes, you have to recognize them, you have to apologize, and to be transparent, to say who we are. So these are the 5 ethics: independence, impartiality, accuracy and fact-based communications, humanity, accountability and transparency. This is the framework within which journalism works. It's what makes journalism different, and it will be at the heart of the work that we will be doing to try to strengthen within journalism that capacity around these core issues. But we're also looking to strengthen the knowledge and understanding within society at large about how these values are important, not just for journalists, but some of them are important in our daily communications. Some of these values are particularly journalistic, independence and impartiality, for example. That's clear. But you can't ask people who are on Twitter or people who are on Facebook and who are using social networks to be independent or impartial. That would be ridiculous, because free expression allows them to say what they want and be as biased as what they want. But we can say anyone who is in the open information landscape, who is in the public sphere of communications, we can say at the very least there are 3 of these ethics which they should support, whether they're journalists or not. One is fact-based communications. None of us should be telling malicious lies. The second is humanity. None of us should be inciting hatred, hate speech, or encouraging violence to others. And thirdly is the ethic of transparency. We should all be transparent. If we go public with our information, we should say who the hell we are and where we come from and what we're doing. So these are ethics we might think about, and we need to debate this, and in our discussions we will be debating how there can be a transfer of some journalistic ethics to the public sphere. It's one of these sort of key issues we'll be looking at. I very quickly want to take you through the problems that we've got. Today we live in a political climate where these values which I've talked about are completely undermined. Because if you look around Europe, you'll find the growth of a political culture which is built on the same attempt to exploit people's uncertainty with false information and so on. So the political challenge is growing about how do we find and build within the political community the respect for democratic values in communications. And when I talk about these issues, I'm not talking about it in isolation, and I'm not talking about it, again, as a theoretical question. Around the world today, there are severe threats to the peace and stability of the world because of misinformation. and disinformation. Russia-Ukraine is one problem. In the Western Balkans, there are still media fighting the conflict that ended years ago. In the Middle East, we find disinformation everywhere. In East Asia, China, Japan, and Korea, there is fake news, warmongering going on. In Africa, again, fake news and disinformation is being used. In South Asia and so on. I'm working today to try to help journalists in Cyprus, for goodness sake, a tiny island in the Mediterranean, north and south, to try to agree on an action to combat hate speech, because they're a divided community, because they are still caught up in a conflict which has been going on for decades. So we have to recognize that this is a global crisis and so on. And we see this in all of these issues: Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, religion, race relations, migration, gender equality, homosexuality. All of these issues are subject to disinformation and abuse and so on. Here is the sort of thing that journalism, why we need journalism. Do we use this picture or do we not use this picture? Facebook censored this picture. Its robotics censored this picture. And they did so because the robot was told, we do not like pictures of young girls who are naked because that is a bad thing. So the robot saw this picture and deleted it, even though it's an iconic and important picture which has represented, in fact, has represented a symbol, an iconic representation of peace and stability and seeking to combat war and the consequences of war. So we need journalists to be able to understand the nuances of why we need certain pictures. This picture, a terrible picture. Everybody knows this picture and everyone knows what it represents. Who chooses to use this picture? What about the privacy of the child? What about the dignity of the child? Who decides to make use of this picture? This is a painful, poignant picture, and it represents the times in which we live. So how do we encourage people to be able to use their humanity in deciding whether or not to use this picture and so on? This is why we need journalism. This is why we need journalism of quality. This is the same picture, but it tells a different story, because this is a picture of human solidarity. This is a picture of empathy. Whereas before, the earlier picture is a picture just of victimhood. Another picture, a terrible picture of violence. Should this picture ever be used? This is a picture which is the closest representation to death that you're ever likely to see. You can see the bullet coming out of this man's head. Should this picture be used? Who decides whether this picture should be used? Unless you have sentient journalists, people who understand the context in which images and ideas and words are to be used, we are not going to be able to understand why pictures like this picture became an incredibly important picture which contributed to a public debate which ended the Vietnam War. So it was an important picture. And the decision to use it by the Washington Post and the New York Times was very controversial. But the question is, what is the public interest? Who decides on these questions? Can you leave this to a robot? Can you leave this to some others? You need sentient, moral human beings to make these decisions. That's why these issues are really important, and this one, of course. Again, another picture. The other picture I show you, this picture, that's a picture taken by a journalist. This picture, not taken by a journalist. This is a picture taken by a propagandist. This is a picture taken by someone who wants to convey a straightforward message of hate, to inspire fear into the community at large, and to, through this image of power and strength, to inspire young people who are alienated in their societies and so on. So how do we make the distinction between these things? This is why, in a world in which we are driven by images constantly, in which our emotions are constantly built up and exploited, we need to have journalists able to be able to make these decisions and so on. So what can we do? Here are the issues which I hope will be at the heart of our project. We want to strengthen journalism, and we want to strengthen editorial independence. We want to encourage within society a challenge to fact-free, abusive and intolerant communications. So we want to clean up the information landscape, and we want to promote responsible communications. And we want to build respect in public sphere for ethics, journalism, and communication values. So how do we prepare for the future of journalism? Here are 4 or 5 things which are essential. 1, we have to face up to a crisis, which is a profound crisis. The best journalism is on the verge of extinction. Why is that? Because there are not market models to be able to support the journalism. So here is a question. If democratic society relies upon access to reliable, useful journalism, in the future, who is going to provide it and who is going to pay for it? Because the evidence is that the current markets will not be able to pay for journalism. So we have to find new forms of funding, a new way of funding journalism. I know that the government in Montenegro has actually been considering this question, because that issue has been put on the table by media organizations. So it's a political challenge. If you want journalism of the future to serve society and to build democracy, you're going to have to pay for it. And we have to find new ways of public funding. Secondly, we have to build trusted brands through ethics and transparency in the management of media. And that is one of the issues we are talking about with media and we want to build on. And thirdly, and this is perhaps the most difficult challenge we have, I say, as I said to you, I've been a journalist for 50 years, but I'm a prehistoric journalist. I lived in a different world. In my world, I used pens and notebooks, and it was a very easy world. I would talk to people, I would write it down, and I would go, and it was very easy. But today, I'm out of date. Today, you cannot be a journalist unless you understand the way the world of technology works. You need to be able to encode. You need to understand big data. You need to understand how to make an algorithm. You need to understand how bots work. You need to be able to be part of that system for the creation and delivery of information in a virtual way, which has changed everything the way we do. So, do we have in our newsrooms the understanding of using artificial intelligence and technological tools, and most importantly, do we have an ethical understanding of how we use these tools and so on? Because today, people can hack into your private email accounts. People can hack into your lives and target you with information and so on. What are the ethics of that? How do we develop that? So, in preparing for the future, we have to point to the need for more investment in journalism, in use of technology, and understanding the use of technology for the future. 4 other things which are important are to engage the audience. The audience now, as I said, is part of the process, but we need to make the audience part of the process in an ethical framework. We have to encourage new journalism, which is rethinking language and context for framing stories. We need to also have what I would call constructive and positive journalism. Journalism must not only be about telling how bad the world is. We also have to give direction to solutions, the way we can positively address crisis. If journalism has any meaning in engagement with society, it has to be part of solving problems, not just about highlighting problems. And we need public alliances to defend pluralism. And one of the issues that we'll be looking at in our program is how do we build these public alliances between media and journalists and so on. And my final points are we must work together to challenge abusive communications, demand responsible communications from corporate and political centers of power, strengthen journalism, and build a new information literacy movement. And my final point is this. In all of this, we have to agree that we do not want the use of law to try to control the content of journalism. Wherever the law is used to control journalism, it leads to self-censorship and it leads to inevitably constraints on free expression. So we want to really focus on self-regulation, which works at 3 levels. At the level of the individual, so individuals understand what their ethical responsibilities are. At the level of the media company, so that media companies are transparent, deal with conflicts of interest, and have ethical management. And we need systems of regulation, self-regulation across the industry. Above all, we need transparency and ethics in public communication.